Damian McCarthy's Hokum opens in a desert. A weathered conquistador, starving and parched, slips a map in a bottle just as he closes in on what we can only assume is a rare and valuable treasure. He stops the bottle with a cork to protect it from the elements, but pushes the cork in too deeply and can't open the bottle again. The only way to retrieve the map now is to shatter the bottle against something hard and unyielding, but he's surrounded for miles and miles by the soft, shifting sand dunes. So he turns to the boy following him, his squire, his companion, and harshly tells him to look away. We are led to believe that the conquistador will sacrifice this boy to achieve his treasure, and then we cut away. We won't understand until the film ends that this scene is the entire film in miniature. A note before we go any further, this essay assumes you've seen the film. We'll be discussing the ending, the central twist, and the architecture of the bookending sequences in detail. Let's talk about what Hokum is actually doing underneath its haunted hotel surface. On its face, McCarthy's third film is a folk horror escape room. An American novelist named Oom Bauman travels to a remote Irish inn called the Bilberry Woods Hotel to scatter his parents' ashes. The hotel's owner spins ghost stories about a witch trapped in the long-locked honey room suite. Oom, who is drunk and contemptuous, calls it Hokum. A bartender named Fiona humors his cantankerousness and shows him a bit of kindness. He later attempts suicide in his room, and Fiona, feeling something is off, saves him. Weeks later, Oom returns to apologize and finds she has vanished. That is the scaffolding of the plot. The film inside it is something else entirely. A story about a man writing himself out of his own bad ending. Now, it's worth pausing here to acknowledge the very long shadow that Stephen King casts over this film. McCarthy is openly working in a tradition King has spent 50 years defining: the haunted alcoholic writer, the remote haunted inn that turns the screws on him, the past that won't stay buried, the unquiet grave. The Shining is the most obvious touchstone, but the deeper homage, the one that most viewers won't catch on first watch, is to the gunslinger, and we'll come back to that. Oom is finishing the epilogue of his Conquistador trilogy. We're told he writes bleak endings reflexively. He even toasts to them at the hotel bar, and the prologue we've seen confirms it. The Conquistador, frustrated, is implied to have killed the boy traveling with him to retrieve the map. It's brutal and grimdark, and it is, we slowly come to understand, only ending Oom has ever been able to write. Because the Conquistador is a mask worn by his author. The desert is the emotional landscape Oom has exiled himself to. The treasure, which is symbolized in the map, the holy destination, the unrelenting pursuit, is the peace he refuses to let himself have. And the boy following the Conquistador, devoted and silent, is a young Oom. The child who, decades earlier, sat watching a children's television show called Jack and accidentally shot his own mother with his father's gun. Every novel Oom has ever written has been a disguised reenactment of that incident. The adult killing the child. The self he has become annihilating the self he holds responsible for his mother's death. He cannot imagine sparing that child because sparing him would mean accepting that the accident was an accident, that the child was not guilty, that there is nothing to punish. And that is what makes Hokum's prologue so quietly devastating on rewatch. We are watching a man execute the child he's been for a crime he was innocent of despite committing. And here's where the King homage sharpens into something a bit more specific than just atmosphere. The Gunslinger, the first volume of Stephen King's Dark Tower saga, opens with one of the most famous lines in modern dark fantasy. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. That gunslinger is Roland Deschain of Gilead, a hardened, single-minded man crossing a wasteland in pursuit of a quarry he cannot let escape his grasp. Along the way, he picks up a boy named Jake, a child from our world who follows him with a quiet devotion. And at the climax of that first novel, Roland is forced to choose between saving Jake and catching the man in black. His quest. He lets the boy die and he chooses the quest. McCarthy's Conquistador is Roland in a different costume. The desert, the boy, the holy obsession with a thing just out of reach, the willingness to sacrifice the child to get there, it's all there structurally. King's gunslinger is haunted by Jake's death until he meets another version of the boy again in the next book. Ohm Bauman has been haunted by his own version of Jake for 40 years. And that's not even the worst of it. Like Ohm, Roland Deschain accidentally kills his own mother, commits matricide, and in that fallout destroys every relationship close to him, ending up alone and isolated. That sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? And there's one more crucial parallel between Ohm and Roland Deschain. Each gets a second chance. Each is returned back to where they began. For Ohm, it's the renewal of life. It's the chance to go on after he's forgiven himself. With Roland, it's a bit more cattywampus than that, but long story short, begins the cycle of his quest over again, but this time with more hope. McCarthy structures the middle of the film as a kind of escape room nightmare. Ohm, investigating Fiona's disappearance, gets trapped in the honeymoon suite, the room the hotel owner claims contains a witch. Ohm finds Fiona's body in the dumbwaiter, and this is guilt for the woman he failed to protect. He sees a hellish version of Jack, the donkey man from his childhood show on the TV, and this is guilt for his mother. He sees the witch herself, who drags the unrepentant into the underworld. Crucially, all of this happens after Ohm's whiskey is spiked by the psilocybin mushroom juice concocted by the hotel's drifter philosopher, Jerry. McCarthy is careful here. The film never confirms whether the witch is literal or hallucinated, supernatural or psychological. But it almost doesn't matter, because what's literal is that Ohm, for the first time in his adult life, is forced to confront his own demons. The honeymoon suite is essentially the room inside his head he has kept locked since childhood, and the witch is what he has put there to keep that past in prison. McCarthy has said in interviews that all three of his features circle the same essential crime: a man's violence against a woman close to him. Hokum is the most fully realized version of that obsession because it triangulates three responses to guilt. The manager of the haunted hotel, Mal, murders Fiona. He'd gotten her pregnant in an affair, and he could not face the disruption that affair would have on his domestic life, so he drugged her and abandoned her in the honeymoon suite to die. Mal feels nothing. He apologizes insincerely and cringingly when caught. He is the film's true villain, the man who weaponizes legends of ghosts and witches to dispose of an inconvenient woman. And it's also in his name. Mal means bad. Jerry, who is our trippy homeless hero, killed his terminally ill wife at her own request. He carries that with him, but not as an albatross, but rather as a necessary evil he's able to live with. Ohm killed his mother as a child, by accident, and has spent 40 years hating himself for it. The witch, which is McCarthy's supernatural force of morality, does not seem to punish according to deed. She punishes according to refusal to acknowledge the deed. Mal, who never confronts or asks for true forgiveness for what he's done, ends up being dragged screaming into the underworld in the film's final act. Yet Ohm, who finally does confront what he's done, is seemingly permitted to escape. In Hokum, what haunts you is not necessarily supernatural, it's the suffering caused by the secret shame carried within. The film's emotional climax is surprisingly sentimental. Trapped, exhausted, and hallucinating, Ohm finally sees his mother as herself, and she forgives him. This is the only authority that could ever truly release Ohm, the person he actually killed, the person whose verdict was the only one that ever mattered to him. McCarthy has revealed in press for the film that an earlier draft of the script ended a lot more bleakly. McCarthy ended up going the merciful route instead, and it's mercy, not just for Ohm, but for the audience that has, by this point, been asked to spend nearly 2 hours with a man who burns his own fans and toasts to despair. The film could have punished him, but it pardons him instead, and we finally, at the end, return to the desert. The film closes the way it opened, with the Conquistador, the boy, the map, and the bottle, but the scene is different this time. The Conquistador does not kill the boy. He lowers the bottle, he turns towards the boy, and he embraces him. For decades, Ohm's fiction has been a recurring execution. He could not stop writing about murder and death and bleak endings because he could not stop committing it inside himself. Once his mother forgives him, the manuscript he was writing is essentially freed, and what we're watching in those final minutes is Ohm in real time meeting young Ohm without wanting to destroy him for the first time. McCarthy lets that resonance hang. The whole film is the gap between these two drafts of the same scene. The horror and the hope is the psychic labor of getting from one draft to the other. The word Om in Sanskrit refers to the primordial sound underlying the universe, the vibration between consciousness itself. Meditating on that sound is supposed to bring you peace. McCarthy gives the name to a man who has spent his life refusing every form of meaning that his name implies, and the film's final act is to let him finally find the peace for which he was named. A man executes his inner child over and over for 40 years. And then finally, one night in an Irish hospital bed, he spares that child. And that's the film.